folks, Nick Donatelli here, and welcome back to the Houdini for MoGraph series. This is the last part of our 3-part lighting and rendering series that we're doing. In this one, we're going to be covering up how to set up your render and composite it all together, so post-production. If you have your file from part 2, you can just continue working off of that, but again, the setup from where we left that is on the site if you want to grab that. And I'm going to be compositing in After Effects, so apologies for those of you who don't use that, but everything I'm doing can definitely be done in other compositing softwares, so you should be able to follow along in whatever method that you use to put your images together. All right, let's get into part 3, rendering and compositing. All right, let's go through the Mantra Render node. So in the Rendering tab, and then the Samplings tab beneath that, you have these pixel samples. This is the primary place that you're going to adjust to eliminate any noise. So I'm going to just crank that to 6 in both. And if I do some before and after screenshots, you can see that it makes our image just a little bit clearer. Now, you want to use the lowest number possible here to avoid long renders. But you still want enough samples to avoid it being noisy. So you really just want to mess around until you find that nice middle ground. The quality settings and the limit settings here can also be tweaked to reduce the amount of samples and speed up render times. And now in the Objects tab, here's where you could tell objects or lights that, like which ones you want to be used. The star means everything. So say you want to use the secondary balls as a holdout. I'm going to add them to the forced matte, and you can see that it actually cuts out the image of where they are. This is nice for, let's say, you're working in a production setting and you just did a smoke simulation, and you only want to render the smoke to be composited in on top of an existing animation. You can hold out whatever is going through the smoke. Now I'm going to head over to the image tab, and this output picture is what you want your render to be called and where it's going to be saved. So I'm going to delete $hip name and the period after that and just replace it with another $os and a slash. So now what $os is the name of the node. So it will be called Mantra 1. So our render is going to be saved in $hip, which is where the Houdini file is saved. Then subfolder there, it's going to be called render. And then subfolder there, it'll be called $os, or it'll be called Mantra1. And then the actual file is going to be called mantra1.1001.exr. Now let's set up render passes. So you go to the Images tab, and then Extra Image is plain. In other renders, this would be called AOVs. Now, you're just going to check on this PZ to get a Z-depth pass. And we'll do 2 custom ones, so hit the plus down here twice. We'll name one puzzle and the other mask. So let's set these up. And the way to do this is you go to your materials, and in your primary materials, we're going to set the mask up first. So we want to have a map of where this inner bit is. So I'm going to bind export after the fit, that distance, to an attribute that we'll call mask. And since we put that in the renderer, if you hit this down arrow, you can see that we can cycle through our different passes. Now our mask, it's highlighting just this primary object, but it's doing the inverse of what we want. So I'm just going to drop a fit and swap the 0 and 1. And there's that. Now we're going to set up the puzzle pass, which is a standard render pass used in post-production to be able to give each object a different color so that you can select it and adjust as needed. So you can do this by making mats that are pure red, green, and blue so that it's easily selectable in post. So make a float to vector and bind export that to puzzle. Now make the red value 1 And you can see we have our primary object all red. So if you copy these two nodes and paste them into our secondary material, you can change the 1 to a 0 and put it as 1 in the green channel. And now you can see we have a puzzle pass. So head to your renderer and click render to disk. Or I'll do render to end place so that we can actually visualize it while it goes. Once this finishes, I'll launch After Effects and read in that file. We'll duplicate the render a few times, naming it Z, puzzle, and depth to get the different passes. In Nuke, you would use the shuffle node to be able to extract the different passes. But here in After Effects, we're going to use extractor. And I'm going to set it to mask. And the one on puzzle to puzzle. And Z. Now in Z, I found that my black and white points for this need to be 7.5 and 8. And then just drop a solid composite and set it to white to fill in the alpha of this map. Next, make a solid background with a ramp set to radial. Just moving it a little bit. Now I like to color pick from the actual image and then just tweak it slightly to be a little flatter. Also maybe separate it a tiny bit in color. And I'm just going to do an adjustment layer with curves on it and curve it down a little bit. And then just draw a mask to make like a fake spotlight. You can change it to subtract and feather it a bunch. And to finish up the background, I'm going to add a fractal noise on the solid and set it to overlay and just bring in the contrast really low so that we have a little bit of a texture in this ramp. Now on the actual render, I'm going to just do a standard S curve just to give it a little bit of contrast. Now I want to make the small balls glow. So I'm going to duplicate this, kill the curves, and use a set matte, picking the puzzle layer that we set up. I'll change it to source and effect. Choose the green channel. So now if you solo that, you can see that we just have our little guys selected. So I'm going to do a fast box blur and screen that on top. And we got a little glow of our small guys. So now duplicate that again and change it to mask layer. And since this is just black and white, change it to luminance. With that soloed, you can see that we have just the middle selected. I'm going to do radial fast blur so that it looks like light is kind of shooting out. And then curves it up a bit just to be brighter. Now to use that Z, I'm going to make an adjustment layer and create a camera lens blur. The camera lens blur effect isn't really the most accurate for depth of field. I personally don't really use it much, but I use something like FL out of focus. But because camera lens blur is free with After Effects, I'm going to use it for the sake of people being able to follow along. I'm going to set that layer to our Z, choosing again effects and mask. And we have some depth of field. Now I just like to add a few overall touch-ups. So first I'm going to make an adjustment layer, set to screen, and do a fast box blur. And you can see it's really bright, so just bring the opacity super low. And this just kind of softens everything up and blends it all together. Now I'm going to do one more adjustment layer, where I'm going to do my final curves so that I can color correct everything globally, but kind of flatten it all together, give it a nice contrast. And then I like to add a channel blur And for this one, I'll use just the blue, bringing it up a little bit, just to kind of give it a little bit of like a photo finish. And then I'll just do a noise, just a plain old noise, and this kind of makes it look less digital, which personally is typically how I like to approach things. And there you have our introduction to rendering and compositing. That's going to wrap up our series on lighting, materials, and rendering. Of course, there's still plenty of topics around these to be discussed. And if you guys have anything specific that you think I didn't cover that you'd like to know about, and just let me know. I know these ones were a little different than the typical tutorials, so I'd love to hear what you think about them compared to the standard Houdini ones. Again, yeah, if there's any tutorials that you'd like to see in the future, please send them my way. The project files are up on the site if you want to grab those. Hope you enjoyed this one, and until next time.